Um, all right, well, welcome everybody. Lots of folks tuning in. Great to see you all. I don't know if anyone reads newspapers, but there's quite a bit going on in the body politic in this country. And here's the amazing thing. I'm not even going to name any person running for president of the United States, even as we convene this call to talk about politics. This is going to be the most rare phone call in America where people of all political stripes from across the country come together to talk politics, but not the capital B, the capital T, or the capital H. We're going to leave those names aside because it's not really germane to what we're doing here. We've got a great call planned. Eric Brunner, I want to kick it to you for some opening comments here before we dive into the substance.
Yeah, greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thank you again for being part of building Veterans for All Voters and the new reform movement that we are all a part of. I'm really excited for today. Just wanted to share a little color commentary. So Paul Oshinsky with More in Common, Paul is here somewhere. And then Mindy Finn with Citizen Data are our guest speakers. I first learned about More in Common, their Hidden Tribes report. If you've never seen it, I think the very first one came out in 2018, right, Paul? The Hidden Tribes. And it's just, it's maybe my most favorite data, one of the reports that I go back to over and over again to help understand and really truly believe that we do have more in common than you would ever realize. The politics industry makes their money off of, divide and conquer, but really there's so much in common that we have. And so that report was really groundbreaking. And then Mindy Finn, I first learned about as a lifelong independent. I'm always disappointed in myself when it takes me a really long time to learn about a fellow independent, especially someone who ran for vice president of the United States as an independent back in 2016. She's a true servant leader and has gone on to do great things with Citizen Data. So we're really excited to have both of them here today. I may have gotten ahead of my skis a little bit, Todd, but I'll kick it back over to you and then we'll have the presentation.
Yeah, no, not at all, Eric. Just huge thanks to all of you who are on the call, whether it's your first time calling in or you've been with us since the start, which was only less than 3 years ago. We're absolutely grateful you're here. We need you here. We want you here. Consider this your new, apolitical home as we kind of, have this split screen experience of, I think in this organization, trying to do some very productive things, some real opportunities for sustained reforms in states across the country. And then, watching kind of what we see play out nationally is, sometimes a different picture. So really just appreciate your time, your attention, everything that you're doing from wherever you're at. It matters a lot, and it's inspiring for us. And I think for people that know you to see that you're stepping forward to do something to solve a challenging situation in our country's history. So I'm gonna, Eric gave great introductions to Paul and to Mindy, really two preeminent organizations helping shape the narrative around what's going on in this country, helping us understand it and give data and insights accordingly. So Eric was privy to a presentation that Paul and Mindy have given previously, and we wanted to bring it to you all for consideration. So I'm going to stop talking. Paul, I'll kick it to you first, if that works, to kind of lead us into the discussion. And I know Paul's got some materials, Mindy's got some data and some materials. And I'd say as we go, if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. And then when they're done, we can open up the floor for live Q&A and discussion as well. So without further ado, Paul, I'll kick it over to you to get us started. Thank you so much to you and your team and Mindy for being with us. We really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Todd. And thanks, Eric, as well. I'm really, really excited to be here and kind of give you an overview of some of the research that we've been doing over the past 2 years. So I think maybe just a little bit of background. So I'm a researcher at More in Common. My background is mostly in political polling as well as political science. And I work on something, I don't know how familiar folks are on the call with this, but it's called the Democracy Communications Collaborative. It's basically a large nonpartisan initiative of organizations in the democracy space who kind of share research, research insights, messaging, things like that, to kind of stay organized as a large and growing field. So our role at More in Common, beyond kind of the organizing component of that, is research. And Citizen Data does a lot of the quantitative research. And for the DCC, which we call it for short, our role has been qualitative research. So eliciting all sorts of quotes and things like that. And we have a panel of Americans, about 200 Americans, who we ask questions to every week. I think I just mentioned that the goal of this presentation is just to kind of share a little bit about our research process, and then some of our foundational research, and probably a few things that are a little bit more relevant to this current election season. So just kind of a brief note on this qualitative panel. So we call it Americans in Conversation. It's basically a group of 200 Americans who, again, we ask all sorts of questions. It's roughly representative of the US across, partisan characteristics, Democrats, Republicans, independents, as well as kind of those standard demographics like age, gender, race, region, things like that. We also have all sorts of data built in. I know Eric was mentioning our hidden tribes segmentation. We have those segments in this panel attached to each participant, as well as Citizen Data's, and Mindy may speak about this later, but they're democracy segments. So some segments to kind of better understand Americans' views on democracy. And what this panel allows us to do, one is look at long-term qualitative data. We set this panel up a year ago. We have panelists on here, many of them since October of 2023. So we're able to see how their views are changing in response to all sorts of political events. As I mentioned, we have very audience-specific data. And then, I think Mindy, again, will speak a little bit more about this, but Citizen Data does some great survey work. And what we try and do is provide a lot of the kind of why to the data, like why are people believing something? And then finally, it's a really great rapid response tool. So we can field kind of a survey and get results back in just a few hours. So yeah, I'm going to share a few different activities with y'all to give you kind of a sense of the insights that we're gaining from this, and some stuff a little more specific to this election. So last year we fielded an activity asking about kind of feelings and expectations about the 2024 election. And yeah, I'm going to share a few quotes here. And I think one thing that's clear is that Americans do think, and it's probably no surprise to anyone on this call, that this election they feel will be similarly divisive as 2020. And I think it's really powerful to see some of these statements in Americans' own words. Eason at the bottom says, "I expect it to be as divisive or even more divisive, unfortunately. I worry that what we saw after the 2020 election was a preview of things to come." So definitely a lot of concerns among Americans in general about this election season. One thing that I wanted to do is kind of unpack some of the concerns among different partisan identities. So if you look at some of these results among Democrats or left-leaning participants, we see that a lot of them are really concerned about something similar to January 6th breaking out. So Rob here at the top says, "Following the insurrection of January 6th, I'm concerned about the possibility of those events repeating themselves." Other people, I think Jason on the right is talking a little bit about misinformation and how that's concerning. And then when you look at conservative responses, there's really a concern about fairness in the election process and the voting process. Timothy here at the top left says, "I'm concerned about the fairness and if they will push the mail-in ballots again. After the last election, I lost a lot of faith in the voting process. This also makes it stressful not knowing if things will be done fairly." So I think, and I'm on the next slide here, I think it's important to note that we ask, kind of what folks' hopes are for the 2024 election. And while there's a lot of doom and gloom, in the previous responses, there's really a clear consensus around hopes for a calm and peaceful election across the board, across our Hidden Tribes groups, and really a hope that Americans can come together after the election. So I think it's just really important to call that out. One issue that has been relevant to our DCC research, at least in the past 2 presidential cycles, is acceptance of election results. So in this activity, we asked Americans, Democrats and Republicans, if they would accept the results if their non-preferred political candidate won the election. So I'm showing a few responses here of folks on the right. And I think many on the right say that they would accept the results of the 2024 election if Biden won. And this is probably, that group of Republicans that is probably not labeled as election deniers. And Adam here says, our elections are still more trustworthy than other nations. And Mitch here at the bottom, Republican, says, I think it's very hard to interfere with elections and would have to be so incredibly widespread that it would be obvious. I think some on the right are already distrusting with the potential of Biden winning. Some people citing that they think Biden lacks support. Others talking again about that issue of voter fraud. So Scott here says, I would probably have doubt at this point because from what I hear from people around me, they do not like Joe Biden at all, and I probably wouldn't accept the results. And finally, folks on the right, I think, also have concerns, especially from the 2020 election with the timing of votes coming in. So Dorian here at the bottom says, it all depends on how it happens. If it's one of those things where all the votes show up overnight, like in 2020, I would have concerns. So again, we asked this kind of similar question to Democrats. We asked them, suppose Donald Trump wins the 2024 election, would you accept the results or view them with doubt? I think, many say they do, though a lot of people say they'd be unhappy with it. Mitch here says, hopefully he doesn't win, but if he does and it's fair, it is what it is. And Benjamin at the bottom says, I would 100% accept them, but would be unhappy about it. So there are Democrats who would kind of have a little bit more skepticism about accepting the results. James here says, I would accept them unless there was evidence to the contrary. He did try to install fake electors, so I would be a little more skeptical of his win. And then kind of the same point that we saw on the left earlier, there are people that just doubt that there are Americans who vote for Trump. So Caleb at the bottom says it's inconceivable that a majority of voters would vote for him. So I think that's kind of important to call out kind of these ways that people are framing and potentially justifying distrust for an election. So we also just asked generally about what issues may make folks distrust the election in 2024. And we see that many Americans are fairly trusting of the voting process. Thomas here says, just because my candidate does not win, I still have to respect the outcome. I trust the voting process. But again, I think what we see among the left right now is that there's really a concern for political violence or something similar to January 6th occurring again. And among the right, there's really a concern about election fraud, something similar happening to 2020. So I wanted to share one more set of data before wrapping up. And I promise there's kind of a hopeful line at the end of this, but this was an activity we did asking Americans about views towards a civil war in our country. We asked people if they feel like a civil war in America is likely to happen in the next 2 decades, as well as kind of what's preventing a civil war from happening in America. I think basically what we found was only about 1 in 5 Americans think that a civil war is likely within the next 20 years. And people mostly cite kind of political extremism from different factions on both sides as potentially igniting this conflict. But again, I think it's important to call out that most Americans do not think that a civil war is likely, and I'm going to go through a few different responses to show you kind of how Americans are thinking about this. So I think if you look at Jean's comment here at the top right, she mentions, I think people are broadly too distracted by their own lives. If anyone is talking about this, they are extremists and only number a few. Adam here on the right says, we are much more integrated and most Americans agree on more topics than disagree. There may be more and more division among politicians, but there is more likely to be a growing distrust and ignoring of those fractions. So among the Americans who do think a civil war is possible, a lot of people, again, talk to or speak to political extremism and also elected officials. So Amanda here says, I'd like to think that no one wants that, but it did seem certain parties in power are doing their best to start one. And I believe people, especially, make irrational emotional choices. I can see people being talked into it. And I think one final set of data, so this is not from Americans in Conversation, but some of larger portfolio of survey work that we've done in the run up to the 2020 election. So we asked Republicans, imagine Joe Biden appears to win the presidential election, but Trump claims the election was stolen. Under those circumstances, which of the following actions would be justified? So we asked, peaceful protests, destruction of property, physical attacks against Joe Biden supporters. And I think what's important to call out, and this is supported in survey research in multiple academic articles, which is that support for political violence is extremely low among the American public. And what we found in this study is that estimations of support for political violence among the other side are really high. So what we show here is Republicans overwhelmingly, 97% reject physical violence. But Democrats think that almost half of Republicans would condone this type of physical violence against people that they disagree with politically. This is kind of the same setup and same data points here, but asking about Democrats' views on this and what Republicans estimate their views. And we see the same perception gap, which is that, overwhelmingly Democrats reject physical violence, but Republicans believe that over half of Democrats would condone this type of political violence. So I think it's really important to call out these sorts of perception gaps because these are things that influence how people think and behave and can even be, used to justify similar actions. So I just wanted to end on kind of one of the things we try and do through the DCC and our broader work in the democracy space is find kind of messaging and guidance that can speak to moments like this and kind of speak to high stress environments. And so this is a message that we tested among, I think it was about 2,000 Americans that gained really strong agreement across various partisan and racial lines. So it says, times are difficult and our country is hurting, but turning to despair and violence isn't the path forward. The way to move from anger or fear is to remember that first we are neighbors and that ultimately we are Americans. This election brings many unknowns. Turning against each other cannot be one of them. So I think I'll probably wrap up there. I know I threw a lot at you, but any questions, happy to answer later on.
Thanks, Paul. That was great. And I just want to underscore that last slide, that last comment, which is part of what we want to be doing as an organization is stepping out with this kind of positive messaging before others beat us to it, with negative messaging, because trying to put negative messaging back in the bottle is harder than stepping out. So as you have conversations with friends and neighbors, or as you're on LinkedIn, or if you're doing any public speaking about the election, it's just to kind of affirm these sentiments that, hey, look, let's remember that we're all neighbors. We all love this country. And that's kind of what binds us. And so we'll share some of the messaging documents after the fact, but I wanted you to hear that last slide as a little bit of a call to action for our network and what we're hoping all of us take inspiration for. So that's really good, Paul. I'm going to, Mindy, if we can go to you next, and then Amir, I see your hand. I'm going to go to Mindy so we can get her content presented as well, and then we'll go to questions from there if that works. And Amir, I'll go to you first. But Mindy, I'll kick it over to you to present some findings from citizen data as well. Thank you for being with us here.
Great. Thumbs up if you can see the slides. Good, awesome. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's wonderful to speak to this group, and it's terrific to see how it has grown and evolved from its founding to play such an influential role in political reform and in strengthening our democracy. So I know this is a lot of data that is kind of being thrown at you today, so just bear it with me. But Paul really covered the relationship between More in Common and citizen data, and what we're doing through the Democracy Communications Collaborative, which has been the catalyst for a lot of the data that he shared and that I'm going to share today. Just kind of quick overview to understand citizen data. So citizen data is actually a social impact for profit, set up that way so we can be flexible to work across many different types of organizations. But we're entirely mission driven in the democracy field to empower other organizations with the data and tools they need to bridge divides, improve lives, and drive real impact for a stronger, more responsive democracy. And all the data that we've been collecting over the almost last 5 years, all gets written to a master database so that we can continue to learn and track trends over time, and understand more about audiences so that we can best communicate them and move them collectively as a field. So I'm mostly going to focus on, again, how our elections are perceived from a trust perspective and political violence, just because that is, the problem we were asked to speak about, and one that is a lot of organizations are really focused on as we get closer to Election Day. So first of all, let me just go back 1 second. We ask, Americans about American democracy. I like to kind of start with this as a grounding point, and how much they are hopeful about the future of American democracy. We see, you can kind of, this is like a glass half full, glass half empty kind of reading, because we have a slight majority who are hopeful, but we also have, about half that are unsure or who are not hopeful. And Gen Z, the youngest generation, are the least hopeful about the future of American democracy. And given their future, that's definitely a trend that's worth paying attention to from our perspective. Many Americans, even while they remain hopeful about the future of democracy, cite seeing a decline. So 53% believe American democracy is becoming weaker. And the top 3 reasons, and we test this all the time, over time, across states, and this is how it continues to show up. And I think this probably is very motivating for this group, but worth remembering is that number 1 is influence of money in politics. Number 2 is political polarization and division. And number 3 is political extremism, which are kind of 3 sides of the same coin. You could see it that way. Trust in elections, has been this area of focus for the field, for a long time, but certainly since 2020, when the Trump and the Republican Party kind of waged a campaign to sow distrust in our elections. And it was very low after those elections and through the course of 2021. And as we've been tracking it over time, we actually see that trust has trended upwards, especially since 2022, when there was a stronger and cleaner election, even amongst Republicans. And partisanship does continue to remain a strong predictor of election trust, with Democrats remaining the most trustful and Republicans the least. But we do see it going up over time, which we find quite encouraging. And though we can't necessarily track causation down to the individual activity or organization, we feel pretty good that across the democracy field, all of the efforts that have gone into building trust and to strengthening elections, including changing, reforming the system or giving opportunities to reform the system, really contribute to this uptick. Civic education remains a priority. So, one of the key things that we've started to dig into is how much voters actually understand elections and how elections are run and what happens. And we found that 30% of voters nationwide couldn't answer correctly when election results were in their state were final and official. They just don't know. And among Gen Z, it was 44% who failed that test. Also, that election education. So education about our elections remains critical in 2024. And as an organization that is looking and focused on various reforms, this comes up a lot, is how do we help? We already have sort of a lack of understanding about how our elections are run, the individual details of election administration. When we change the system, we have to get voters educated and caught up to that as well. Only 1 in 3 Gen Z voters feel sufficiently informed about the 2024 election, and a plurality want more info. They're feeling like they want more info about how our elections are run. They're really seeking that. And there's a 22% and 7% decrease in feeling informed for Gen Z and millennials respectively from November 2023. So as we've tracked this over time, we actually see, I think probably because we're getting closer to a big election, that voters are registering. They're saying, we don't feel sufficiently informed, we want more information. So pivoting over to the political violence question. So political violence does remain a big concern, especially among younger generations. So if you can kind of look at these smaller bars, what it's showing us, the green is Gen Z and millennial, the orange is Gen X, and the purple is boomer. And the acceptance of political violence against elected officials varies significantly by generation, where we have the younger generation being much more positive and warm to this concept of political violence as an acceptable kind of tool and act against elected officials. If the result isn't what you think it should be, if you think there was an error or an issue with the election, et cetera. And so that is definitely a trend that we and many of the organizations we work with are focused on, because it's an area of concern. And we asked about, but went deeper into what activities do they think would be okay, killing or physically harming someone, destroying a public property or public or private property, harassing or intimidating, et cetera. We still see the, obviously vast majority of Americans, or the fly on my face, who think it is completely unacceptable. So, 90% of boomers, 80% of Gen X, but only 48% of millennials who say none of the above are acceptable acts. Let's see. So key opportunities. Paul mentioned this, so I'll dive into it. So one of the ways that we've been approaching a lot of our research, which informs communications campaigns, is from an audience first approach. So we found that a lot of organizations, they want to reach broader than their current audiences, but did not have a good sense of how do they go about that. I think there was sort of a really universal recognition that it's a lot easier to get kind of the tip of the spear kind of volunteers, people like you and I who are on this call. And, a lot of the efforts can go to just communicating, kind of preaching to the choir, communicating to each other. And we need to understand how we can go beyond that and who we're actually trying to reach. And there's many ways to approach this. We've done much more refined segmentations for various democracy reform efforts. But very simply, we broke this down as part of the Democracy Communications Collaborative into 3 categories. The first being democracy defenders. So these are the people that already have trust and faith in elections. They want to strengthen, they have faith in democracy. They want to strengthen democracy. They tend to lean Democrat. They tend to lean 65 plus. They're more likely to be, liberal and conservative, et cetera. But, among that group, there are conservatives, and we have those people identified. And this is about 21% of voters. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you really have those people who, when I showed you the political violence question, were more disposed to say that political violence is okay. They're more likely to spread disinformation. And we call these the democracy inhibitors. And that's about 13% of the population. And you can see they're more likely to be Republican, not solely, but more likely, male, white, rural, very conservative. And then in the middle, we have these shifters. And this is the vast majority, this is a majority of Americans, about 2/3 of Americans. We can break them up much further, but this is really when we got to the point of persuasion, kind of how do we move people up the ladder and into this democracy defender category? The shifters are those that, we would be suggesting to target. And we know exactly where to reach them. So I point this out just because this can be applied to, other efforts, the same kind of approach. Again, we've done this around ranked choice voting. So we've created the segments that are most disposed to support ranked choice voting, those that need to be persuaded or shifted, those who are going to be the most resistant, et cetera. messaging can move the needle. So most recently, we have done a set of pretty sophisticated experiments and tested various messages for moving shifters towards greater trust in elections, to less support or acceptability of political violence. We had theme A, which was around providing more education and facts about our election. And this was the message that performed best: was it's better to be accurate than fast. A little patience gives us the peace of mind that results will be legitimate. And that increased election trust by 55%. We had a transparency message, which you can read there: based on the ideals of our strong democratic institutions, election results are triple checked for accuracy before they're sent to officials for certification. And then when it came to violence, the top messages were: in the upcoming 2024 election, we must all unite against the use of violence as a way to manipulate election results and contradict what our founding fathers wrote in the Constitution. And then we have one about January 6th, which we found we were very fact-based. We were letting people know that more than 2,000 people broke into the Capitol. 140 police officers were assaulted and 5 Americans were killed. And these were built based on research that's been ongoing over the last year. So there were many focus groups, for example, to hear what were the drivers of the lack of trust. What kind of transparency were voters looking for when it came to something like violence? How much do people know the facts about, sort of the worst cases of political violence and what happened? So even for January 6th, for example, many voters thought it was just 100, 200 people or a few hundred people as opposed to 2,000 people. They didn't realize that 5 Americans were killed and 140 police officers were hurt. And so that's how these were constructed. And I just have a couple more slides here. This just shows, and I won't spend too much time on it, that we're always tend to look at this messaging research through the lens of audience. So how does it move those defenders, the people who are already strongly in support of democracy and reform, versus shifters versus inhibitors? And we do see distinctions quite a bit. So sometimes it's not just about kind of what's the most rallying message to convert the already converted, but how are we moving shifters? And that's what leads us to identify or make recommendations about messaging. Paul, I think, pointed to this, but I'll just touch on it briefly. That one of the key things that we found, and I think this is an important takeaway, is voters are very sensitive to, especially those we're trying to shift and convert, and to messaging that seems propaganda-y. It's not a real word, but I'll use it because this particular voter that's quoted here used it. And there's a fine line between what is deemed propaganda-y versus not. And so in this grid, you can see that a message that did, well, does talk about we all must unite against the use of violence as a way to manipulate election results and contradict what our founding fathers wrote in the Constitution. That unite language tends to be very strong, and people care about the founding fathers and the Constitution. But on the other hand, a message that does not do as well is when we kind of talk in more, I think, detached terms. So Americans choose our leaders with voting, not violence. Let's respect our Constitution and honor the founding fathers by standing up for those values. And so sometimes it really is a fine line. And then finally, and this should be music to the ears of this organization, but we're always interested in messengers and which messengers are most effective. And this goes down to very local areas where we test kind of very local influencers and leaders. But from a broad perspective, we see with our defenders and our shifters that military personnel and veterans and election workers, when it comes to messaging on elections and on political violence, are highly trusted. Followed by local police and law enforcement, and then kind of professors, teachers, librarians at local academic institutions. When we've gone more granular, interestingly enough, we've seen that firefighters in particular are very trusted, which is kind of interesting. And so we see that some of our friendly organizations in the space are using that guidance as they build their communication campaigns. I'll leave it there.
Mindy, that was great. Thanks so much. And I want to get to the crew here for your questions. And I want to amplify one thing and maybe get a reaction from you and, add your thoughts. But part of what, as an organization, we want to do is to sort of honor, in some ways, the malcontent with election systems. And it's not that elections are stolen, but there is a sense that like these elections don't feel representative, which is actually like an opinion that we would co-author and say, yeah, 87% of House districts are not competitive. Can you talk to us about nuancing the messaging a little bit? Because what we don't want to do is say American democracy is fine. Your only job is to vote, and trust the process, but to sort of honor a sense that like it feels flawed that most races aren't competitive. It feels flawed that this presidential race is going to come down to 6 states and some finite number of counties. It maybe feels flawed to the left that like, why does the person that gets the most votes not win? It feels flawed to the right that that other things are true. So how do you talk to us about the nuance of beyond like reinforcing that like the mechanics of the system are solid and should be trusted, but then like pivoting into kind of a reform narrative? How do you have any thoughts on that? Advice for us?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of rounds of research about kind of the trust in the election process, where we've gone more in depth on how explaining, how it works and how people are elected. And what we have found in that message testing is that there is value in kind of acknowledging that, like when there is any kind of error caught, the experts that are running elections are quick, to address it, and it doesn't impact the final tally. Or even using specific examples. So like in Arizona, there was a tabulation issue, the tabulator like printing issue in 2020, and they were quick to fix it, created a backup, but they were quick to fix it. They were quick to be very transparent about what happened and speak about it and answer a lot of questions. And so we have find that there's value in that, though really important to kind of quickly pivot to the fact that broadly, like while our elections can always be improved, that they're legitimate, like the results are legitimate and valid. Talking about risk limiting audits, talking about like that's an example where most voters, when we've done a lot of focus groups, like when you ask, how can we improve elections? Well, they just need to be audited. Like we need actual audits, and they don't realize that the vast majority, well, every state has some kind of audit, but the vast majority have multiple audits. And so it's that kind of information that they need. And that's part of the voter education effort, I think, job to do. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the long answer. The short answer to your question is yes, to avoid being propaganda-y, we found value, particularly with the less trusting voters, to acknowledge briefly that they're not perfect, but to also at the same time legitimize the ultimate results and outcomes as valid.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful, because I think, the right sort of keeps the conversation on election security. The left tends to keep the conversation on ballot access. And we are talking about almost like a third narrative, which is the elections work as designed, but let's have a conversation about the design, right? So there's nothing nefarious, but we should talk about open primaries versus closed primaries, or plurality elections versus majority winner models and things like that, which is a little wonky. But okay, this is great. Thanks so much, Mindy. And Amir, if you still have the question, go ahead, and then if folks have questions, just go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll call on you from there.
Hello from St. Louis, Missouri. So my question is, did you guys notice, or did you research anything on foreign interference in our elections? Because, especially through social media, psychological operations of adversarial, even allied nations, has been going on through the roof. And I'm curious, how voters respond to information that originates from abroad and gets plastered all over here as if it's domestic. Are they okay as long as it's, with my team, or do they take a problem, or do they have a problem, or do they see a problem of foreign interference in our elections? because
Great
it's not just social media. We even have politicians coming in, heads of foreign states, and that's plural, who are coming over here to cheer on a specific candidate, which is pretty mind-boggling.
Amir, that's a great question. And Paul, Mindy, feel free to weigh in. And I do know that even, and Eric, you can correct me here, but like Maine, for example, has had a ballot initiative about restricting foreign money in politics, because there was something like, how much money was it, Eric? Some absurd amount of money was spent by foreign actors in Maine's elections. And that was sort of above board spending. That was reported spending, not to mention foreign country interference. So good question. Is there any flavor, Mindy or Paul, that you can speak to about perceptions of foreign influence in elections?
I mean, I'll just say that certainly after in the 20s, kind of 16 to 2020 time period, and then to some extent after 2020, we were tracking that and we did see that people are concerned about it. But after 2020, it was really dwarfed by the concerns just around people believing that there was, the election was illegitimate and that vote by mail was like they were feeling distrustful of the shifts to vote by mail and drop boxes and basically all the things that Donald Trump was telling them were wrong with the system. Those became the prevailing concerns. Foreign interference remained a concern, but just at a much lower level than the 2016 to 2020 timeline.
Great.
I say
Thanks,
foreign
Mindy.
money, yeah, and influence.
Other questions about the data?
While we're waiting for other questions, I was at the DC summit, DCC summit back in February, Mindy, and one of the things you presented that I found really, there's so many nuggets, but the definition of democracy that most resonated with Americans. This is one of my pet peeves about people throwing around the word democracy, and it's overused, and now it's kind of become a dog whistle for one side. But and correct me if I'm wrong, Mindy, but it was government of, by, and for the people was the definition of democracy that resonated with the most or the highest number of Americans. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So we've done a lot of testing on how people perceive democracy, like what is their definition and how they perceive various terms that are often used around democracy and who they associate them with. On that definitional question, we do see the most consensus around the definition of democracy as of, by, and for the people. And even over time, we've been tracking that since 2019, I believe was the first time that we kind of tested that in a certain way and we've continued to, and we've seen more movement towards that. So more coalescing around that as a definition, which I kind of find a bit encouraging actually, because some of the other definitions that people identify with as democracy are, a government that is just serving my particular interests. And so, that isn't necessarily going to work. So people aren't going to get their way every time. So, yeah, there has been a coalescing even more so around that of, by, and for the people definition.
And I think that's helpful for us too, because there's so many tripwires. We don't want to, there's so many kind of virtue signals that happen around if you choose words. And so really, what are we talking about here? Government of, and by, and for the people. When we talk about elections, we talk about competition in elections, voters' abilities to express themselves. So I think re-anchoring ourselves on the values, not so much the words, is I think part of the task here. Doug, let's go to you and then to Derek.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. I had posted this question earlier in the chat, and Paul was kind enough to answer, but I'd like to get a little more in depth into it. And that is the role of the media in creating the divisiveness that we currently see, because, we know that we agree more than we disagree. However, this is not reported. The only thing that is reported is the disagreement. And so I'm wondering, as far as the frustration that is seen with this type of reporting, Paul answered, yes, you did find this in your research. but I'd like to get a little bit more in depth into that, because as long as we keep buying, they're going to keep giving it to us. And so, and it's all they report is, the negative. They don't report because it's not interesting that we all agree on most things. So I'd just like to get a little bit more of an expanded answer from that.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in quickly. And first, I'd love to share just something really quickly, and maybe I can just share screen for 2 seconds. But this is from our More in Commons Perception Gap study in 2019. And essentially what this graph is showing, so the larger the bar on it, the higher the misunderstanding is among someone and their views in the other party. So what this is showing is that people that get their news from places like Breitbart, talk radio, conservative shows, other ones, have really, really, really high misunderstandings of who the average Democrat is. They typically think that the average Democrat is much more progressive and much more extreme in their views. And the same with other sites, like MSNBC and things like that. So I just wanted to point that out because we do have evidence that more partisan people who watch more partisan news sources have pretty warped perceptions of the others in the political party. So I just wanted to kind of affirm that based on our research, but also just mention that, I mean, like, a lot of media is just based on clicks and what people are interested in, and a lot of stuff that is divisive is the stuff that gets clicked on and shared. And yeah, I don't have the answer to that, but that is kind of the nature of the media environment.
Can
Thank
I,
you. Appreciate that.
thanks, Doug. It's a great question, something that we wrestle with as well. Can I ask Paul, you or Mindy, because there's a lot of comments on this in the chat, and then we'll go to you, Derek. Can you talk about this generational divide of acceptance of political violence? Is that just like a youth curve that matures out, or is this something, I don't know how longitudinal the data is, or is this something that we think is like an enduring trend that will kind of continue to age up with the same belief system?
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of hard data on it just from our perspective, because we've only been tracking it for a few years. But we do have the landscape analysis. When we look at other data, it's a bit of a both and. So there's, I think, an expectation, just looking at kind of times of political unrest or civil unrest in the past, is that it does tend to be, you have younger people who are joining in that, who are kind of like they're less kind of grounded in the repercussions. They're more rebellious in kind of their nature. And maybe have more time on their hands and they're less grounded and in responsibilities. And so I think it's fair to expect that some of that would kind of burn off as people get older. On the other hand, based on what I just said, I don't know that we can expect like trends from the past to repeat, because there were certain things that were factors in the past that don't exist now. For example, we've seen a decline in civic participation, civic institutions. Just the whole like civic fabric of the country has broken down. So people there, don't have the same kind of clubs, the same kind of attachments and attendance. They're delaying certain things that would have occupied time before, like marriage and family and those kinds of things. And so I think it's something that needs to be watched. It's a trend that is concerning, that we can't just kind of expect will burn off in the ways that it has in the past, even though we could probably expect a bit of that to happen.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
If I could jump in just super quickly, I was just going to mention that we've done a lot of this polling too, and polling and just kind of surveying people on political violence is really tough to do. There's issues that you can have with respondent disengagement and things like that, people not paying attention. And that's not to say that's what's happening here, but it's something we've thought a lot about in our research as well. And there's actually a really great paper if anyone wants to check it out on surveying on political violence, because it's very tough to do.
Thanks, Paul. Let's go to Derek and then Stan. We'll go to you, and that might be all that we have time for. Derek, Oregon. Over
Yeah. So I was just wondering, and I apologize if this was answered. I jumped in partway through. In regards to perceptions on our election system and whether it's valid or fraudulent, all that kind of stuff, was any consideration given to states that have had mail-in voting for quite some time versus states that stood it up during COVID? I ask because I'm out in Oregon, and we switched to all mail-in voting, I believe, in 1987. So there really there was no concern about the validity of the election due to mail-in ballots until after the election had occurred. And then there was, a major push towards, hey, this mail-in voting, we don't know if this is accurate or not. And then that became a concern where it hadn't been prior. So I'm just wondering if that length of time that states have used mail-in voting impacts their view of the validity of our elections.
I'm happy to take that quickly, but all I can say is that's a great question that I don't think we've thought about in the data. So would love to just take a note of that, and definitely would like to look at that at some point. I don't know if Mindy, you have thoughts.
Yeah, same. I mean, we have seen just back in 2020, we did a lot of work around the shift to mail-in voting to help election officials adjust to that, both in their communications and their resource allocation. And, we've found, obviously, those that are in states where there's been longstanding mail-in voting or more universal mail-in voting, that there's obviously greater trust in it than states for whom it was new and kind of thrust upon them just because of the pandemic in 2020. And that makes sense. I mean, there's just familiarity, and it kind of tracks a trend that even when we look at trust in elections, a consistent theme we see is that voters are more likely to say that they trust their election. So they trust when they go and cast their vote, they trust that vote's going to be counted correctly. They trust the administration of their local election, but then they have broader concerns about how elections are run in other states. And so I think that answers it both from a mail-in voting perspective, but also just we're more likely to trust what we know and more likely to distrust what we don't know.
That's great. Thanks. The other thing I'm curious about, building on your comment, Derek, and Eric and I can maybe take this back to United America, but are more inclusive and representative election models like they have in Alaska, ranked choice voting, open and competitive primaries, I would hope that enhances trust in elections because you see more options exhibited. But I don't know if there's a data-driven answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen there's kind of two sides to that coin. So we've seen that it certainly, like it should over time, that, any kind of change, like given what I just said, there's going to be an education hurdle that you need to just work through to get voters comfortable. And also that sometimes it's when voters actually have an opportunity to utilize a new system, that trust will increase over time versus it being a theoretical system that, again, change is something to fear until you actually go through it and you realize, okay, this is not something to fear. So I think the idea is that it will build trust over time. There's data to support that. And it's kind of an important, I think, probably data point to track over time so that you can help continue to press the case for why these election changes are helpful, not only to give voters more agency, but also to build overall trust.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Mindy. Stan from Idaho, this will be the last question.
Okay, thank you. I think that, I've picked up a couple of really interesting points. I especially liked that most people like the definition of government by and for and of the people, kind of transposed with the fact that most people have no faintest clue how the election system works. And I think that that's a good in for us. Okay, first off, to capitalize on our trust as veterans. And second off, we need to set up a little bit of cognitive dissonance when we start talking to people, say, you know, you feel disenfranchised and as if your vote doesn't count. Most likely it doesn't, because, you know, a lot of candidates are voted in with fewer than 10% of voters participating. How do you reconcile the love for democracy with going along with a system that is so obviously dysfunctional? Well, the military answer is, if what you're doing isn't getting the mission accomplished, you change what you're doing. And Americans have already done that. You know, you need to point out to people who are not civically educated that the election system has changed numerous times over the last, you know, at least 100 years. And our local demagogues are saying, you know, one man, one vote has worked for 250 years in America. And my response is, that's always been an aspirational goal and is still an aspirational goal. And we're working toward that goal by opening primaries and having ranked choice voting. So you get a larger playing field, more choices, et cetera. And I think people will like that. So I think it's a good in for us. We have a specific challenge in our area where we were invited to speak to a chamber of commerce, but only given 5 minutes in their busy schedule. And so I put out the challenge to our members to come up with your very best 5-minute elevator speech. And then we're going to come up with handouts to hand out to the people there in attendance so that they can follow up after. Hopefully we give a nice sparky teaser speech. So, you know, you need to have a good elevator speech, and you need to have a good grasp of how the process has changed, and let people know it's okay to change when the system isn't working.
That's a great note to end on, Stan. And I want to affirm a couple points. One is, and Mindy and Paul, feel free to correct me, and also huge thank you for joining us. One is that the messenger really matters, almost more than the message. So you all stepping out as speakers really matters, and people are looking for, who can I listen to and who can I trust? So that's a key takeaway. The other is that we need to affirm democratic values before they're challenged. So we need to step out now and be universal in you know, that political violence is never acceptable. We need to be quick, you know, having just lived through an assassination attempt in this country, quick to say that is never the answer. And then, Paul, the messaging that you shared, which is that, you know, elections are run by us. You know, we do them, our neighbors do them, and challenging people. If you have distrust, then go volunteer, because the quickest way for people to understand that the elections are safe is to actually become election workers themselves, and then they kind of see how the process unfolds. We are members of Vet the Vote, the Vet the Vote Coalition, so we're really trying to actively recruit military veterans and military spouses to be poll workers. So asking people to get up close to the thing that they are suspect of, you know, if you're suspicious, then go be a poll worker, go volunteer, see what it looks like, learn how it works. And then I shared in the chat the messaging guide that we have as an organization. So do take a look at that. It's driven in part by research from Citizen Data and More in Common. So it builds off of the research of these two great organizations into veteran-specific language. And the punchline is, move away from buzzwords, move into values. As Stan said, we're not trying to convince everyone that it's all perfect. What we are trying to do is affirm, look, the mechanics work. You know, it's not nefarious. What is broken are the rules that we've created around our election systems that aren't inclusive, don't allow independents to participate, and that we have agency to change. We can do it. We've always done it in the history of this country. Every state does it differently. So we can have a conversation about whether or not we here in Idaho or New Mexico or Arizona like the way it's done. If you want more choices, let's get more choices. We can do that. It's open primaries, it's ranked choice voting. So I think honoring people's feelings, but moving them into productive solutions is something that the two major parties in the mainstream media are not going to sort of do. So that is, in fact, what I think the role that we can play in this whole thing. So I know we're at time, but just gratitude to each of you. Thank you for joining us, for what you're doing in your communities and in your states, presenting solutions, reaffirming American values. disavowing political violence, disavowing angry rhetoric. It's unproductive. We're exhausted by it, but we can have a conversation about what's productive and what we can do together as citizens. Mindy, Paul, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time and insights, not only on this call, but for all the work that you do in the background. And it certainly has informed Eric and I and how we grow and shape this organization. So thank you to you in particular for spending this time with us. And everybody else, thanks for what you're doing on the ground. Reach out to Eric and I if we can be helpful. And as always, we're here to serve you. Thanks for what you're doing in states across the country.